There are nights when the world feels older than we remember, when the air grows still and the stars seem to watch from distances we cannot name. In those moments, if you listen carefully enough, you might sense something beneath the surface of time, now memory that does not belong to you, yet feels strangely familiar. It is the kind of knowing that lives in the bones passed down through generations, who never spoke its name aloud, but carried it nonetheless. A weight, a silence, a story pressed into clay by hands that trembled as they worked. Imagine for a moment a library that exists not in grand halls or towering shelves, but in fragments, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, each no larger than your hand, covered in wedge-shaped marks that were once the clearest form of human expression. These are the remnants of Sumer, the earliest civilization we can still touch, still read, still hear across the gulf of 5,000 years. They speak of kings and harvests, of deaths and prayers, of gods who walked among mortals and then quietly withdrew. But among these ordinary records, these lists and hymns and contracts, there are tablets that describe something else, something that does not fit comfortably into the rhythm of ancient life. They describe fire that fell from the sky, not the fire of lightning or the sun's warmth, but something vast and consuming. Fire that turned stone to liquid, fire that left shadows burned into walls where people had once stood, fire followed by winds that stripped the earth bare, by darkness that swallowed the day, by silence so complete that even the birds forgot their songs. The descriptions are brief, fragmented, written in the measured cadence of people who did not yet have words for what they were trying to preserve, but they remained carved into clay, baked hard by time, waiting. What if those tablets were not speaking of myth? What if they were trying to tell us something that happened, something witnessed, something remembered imperfectly through generations, something so terrible that it could only be whispered in the language of gods and divine wrath because no human framework could contain it? We do not say this is true, we cannot, but we can listen to what the clay remembers. The tablets speak of a weapon called the brilliance of the gods. They describe it as something that could be carried, yet held the power to obliterate cities. When it was unleashed, the texts say, the sky tore open, light brighter than 1,000 suns filled the horizon. Those who looked upon it were blinded instantly. Those who stood too close were reduced to ash before they could cry out. The heat was so intense that stone melted and sand fused into glass rivers boiled away. The air itself became poison. In one fragment, a scribe writes of soldiers who survived the initial blast, but died days later, their skin peeling away, their hair falling in clumps, their bodies betraying them in ways no sword or spear could explain. Another tablet describes a city that was left standing, its walls intact, its gates undamaged. Not a single living thing remained within, as if life itself had been erased by something invisible, something that left no mark except absence. These are not the usual descriptions of ancient warfare. There are no spears, no arrows, no siege engines. There is only light, heat, and a silence that stretches long after the violence ends. For centuries, scholars read these passages and assumed they were exaggerations. Poetic flourishes, the language of people trying to make sense of natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, massive storms. And perhaps they were right. Perhaps that is all this is. But then in the mid-20th century, humanity created something new, something that had not existed before, as far as we knew. And when the first atomic bomb detonated over a desert in New Mexico, those who witnessed it struggled to find words. They spoke of light that swallowed the world, of heat that turned sand to glass, of a silence that followed profound and unnatural, of shadows burned into stone where people had stood moments before. The language they used, these modern witnesses, these scientists and soldiers, echoed something ancient, something already written, something pressed into clay thousands of years before Hiroshima, before Nagasaki, before the word nuclear existed in any human tongue. Perhaps it is coincidence, the way all catastrophes share a vocabulary of terror and awe, or prescribing something they had seen, something they had inherited from even older voices. a memory carried forward through time, growing dimmer with each retelling, until it became myth, became legend, became the wrath of gods. Because no other respite, the Sumerians did not arrive in the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates as primitive wanderers, slowly learning to farm and build. They appeared suddenly with a fully formed writing system, advanced mathematics, complex astronomy, and knowledge of agriculture that should have taken centuries to develop. Their own texts speak of this knowledge as something given, something taught by beings they called the Anunnaki, those who came from the sky. We are told these are gods. Of course, divine figures, metaphors for natural forces or distant kings elevated to celestial status. And perhaps that is all they were. But the tablets describe them differently than other cultures describe their gods. The Anunnaki are not omnipresent. They do not dwell in some unreachable heaven. They are physical. They arrive, they depart, they grow old, they argue among themselves, they make mistakes, they fear certain things, covet others, and most strangely, they possess weapons that sound disturbingly familiar to anyone who has read accounts of modern atomic warfare. One text describes a conflict between these beings, now war in heaven, that spilled onto Earth. The details are sparse, but the results are not. Cities burned, the sky darkened for years. Animals died in their fields. People fled to the mountains and hid in caves, emerging only after the winds had carried the poison away. When they returned, they found their homes intact, but their families gone, as if something had reached into the world and selectively erased life, while leaving stone and bronze. There is a particular tablet, damaged and incomplete, that describes the aftermath of one such weapon's use. The scribe writes of visiting a battlefield where two armies had clashed. He expected to find bodies, the usual carnage of war. Instead, he found something else. The soldiers were there, thousands of them, but they had not been cut down. They lay where they had stood, their weapons still in their hands, their formations intact. There were no wounds, no blood. They had simply stopped, as if whatever animated them had been pulled away in an instant. The scribe, clearly disturbed, writes that the bodies could not be touched. Those who tried to move them for burial grew sick within hours. Their skin developed sores. They vomited blood. They died within days, and their bodies too could not be touched. Eventually, the entire battlefield was abandoned, marked as cursed ground, left for the desert to slowly reclaim. But the description does not quite fit. Plague spreads, slowly, needs contact, moves through populations in waves. This was instant, contained, and it affected those who merely approached the dead, not through breath or touch, but through proximity alone. It sounds uncomfortably like radiation poisoning. Sites where archaeologists dig carefully through layers of earth and ash, expecting to find the gradual accumulation of human habitation, pottery shards, tools, the slow evidence of daily life. Instead, they find something else. A sudden break, a layer of intense heat, stone that has been vitrified, transformed into glass, by temperatures that should not have existed. Sand fused into green glassy fragments identical to trinitite, the substance created at the Trinity test site when the first atomic bomb turned desert sand into a new form of matter. These places exist. They are not legend. Archaeologists have documented them, puzzled over them, proposed explanations that range from massive fires to meteor. And perhaps those explanations are correct. Perhaps each site has its own mundane answer, its own natural catastrophe that happened to produce extreme heat at just the right intensity to melt stone. But when you look at them together, when you see how many of them exist, scattered across the ancient Near East, often near the cities mentioned in those troubling Sumerian texts, now a pattern begins to emerge, not proof, never proof, but a whisper that grows louder the longer you listen. The city of Mohenjo-daro, in what is now Pakistan, was discovered in the 1920s. It was a marvel, one of the great urban centers of the ancient Indus Valley civilization. Dating back nearly 5,000 years, the city was planned with extraordinary precision. Streets laid out in perfect grids, an advanced sewage system, clear evidence of a sophisticated, organized society. But Mohenjo-daro did not decline gradually. As most ancient cities do, it did not fall to invaders or succumb to famine or disease over generations. It ended suddenly. Archaeologists found skeletons scattered in the streets, lying where they had fallen, many holding hands as if they had been fleeing together when something stopped them mid-stride. The positions suggested instant death, not the slow collapse of siege or starvation, but something immediate and overwhelming. More disturbing were the condition of the bones themselves. Many showed signs of extreme heat, yet the buildings around them were largely intact. The heat had been intense enough to affect human remains, but somehow selective, not burning everything equally. And then there was the black stone. Scattered throughout the ruins, researchers found fragments of stone and sand that had been melted and fused together, turned to glass by temperatures estimated at around 1,500 degrees Celsius or higher, the same temperatures produced by nuclear detonation, the same strained glassy residue found at atomic test sites. No conventional fire burns hot enough to produce this effect. Not wood, not oil, not even the most intense ancient furnace. The heat required is industrial, modern, or we allow the thought to surface. Something else entirely. The official explanation involves a massive fire, perhaps multiple fires, fueled by unknown sources. But the pattern does not quite match. They consume, they leave ash and charcoal and the evidence of prolonged burning. What was found at Mohenjo-daro suggests something instantaneous, a flash, a moment of impossible heat, and then silence. The Sumerian tablets speak of a place called Bad Tibira, one of the 5 cities said to have existed before the Great Flood. The text describe it as a center of metalworking, a place where the knowledge of shaping bronze and copper was taught. But they also describe its end. The city, they say, was consumed by the brilliance of the storm god Iskir, a weapon so terrible that even the gods who commanded it withdrew in fear afterward. The heat was such that metal melted in the streets, stone turned to powder. The few who survived fled into the mountains and did not return for a generation, fearing the land itself had been poisoned. We do not know where Bad Tibira stood. Its location has been lost, buried beneath millennia of sand in the shifting courses of ancient rivers. But the description remains, and it describes something that should not have been possible. Not with the technology we believe existed. Not with bronze and copper and the limited fuel sources available to people who had only just learned to write. Unless they inherited the memory of something older, something that happened before Sumer itself, before the cities we can still name, and the kings whose deeds were recorded, before the flood that the tablets insist washed away the first world, leaving only fragments of what came before. The tablets speak of this earlier time with a strange mixture of reverence and sorrow. It was an age when the Anunnaki walked openly among humans, when the gods had not yet withdrawn, when knowledge flowed freely and the works of that age were greater than anything that followed. But it was also an age that ended in fire. The texts are clear on this. There was a war, a conflict between factions of these ancient beings. And in that war, weapons were used that should not have been. Weapons that violated some unspoken boundary, some rule even the gods understood should not be crossed. One fragment, translated from a damaged tablet found in the ruins of Nippur, describes the moment when one of these weapons was first unleashed. The speaker, believed to be a priest or witness, recording the event, writes of a light that rose from the horizon, growing brighter and brighter, until it became unbearable to look upon. There was no sound at first, only silence, and then a roar that shook the earth itself. A wind followed, hot and violent, that tore trees from the ground and flattened buildings as if they were made of reeds. And then came the fire. Not flames that burned upward, but fire that fell from the sky in waves, consuming everything it touched. The writer describes hiding in a cave, deep beneath the earth, and even there feeling the heat through the stone. When he emerged, 3 days later, the landscape had changed. The river had dried up, the animals were gone, and the city he had fled from, that place he had known his entire life, was no longer recognizable. Its towers had collapsed, its walls had crumbled, and everywhere, the strange glass that crunched beneath his feet like broken pottery, but sharper, darker, wrong in a way he could not name. That the place made him sick, that even breathing the air felt dangerous. He traveled north, toward the mountains, and did not look back. The tablet ends there, mid-sentence, as if the scribe could not bring himself to finish the thought. This is not the only such account. Across the ancient world, in texts from Mesopotamia, from Egypt, from the Indus Valley, from pre-Vedic India, there are stories of wars fought with weapons that should not have existed. The Mahabharata, one of the great epics of ancient India, describes something called the Brahmastra, a weapon so powerful that it could destroy entire armies. The descriptions are vivid, almost technical. The weapon produces a column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns. Those who survive the initial blast are burned by invisible fire. Their hair falls out, their nails crack and peel. They vomit blood and die slowly over weeks, even though they bear no visible wounds. This is not myth speaking in vague metaphors. This is a description of radiation sickness written thousands of years before anyone should have known such a thing existed. The epic warns that the Brahmastra must never be used lightly, that it carries a curse, that the land where it is unleashed will be poisoned for generations, that nothing will grow there, that the water will become undrinkable, that even the wind will carry death to those who pass through. And then, most strangely, the text says that after a great war in which such weapons were used repeatedly, the knowledge of how to create them was deliberately hidden. Why? Buried, forbidden. Because those who survived realized that some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. We read these texts as mythology, as the imaginative flowering of cultures trying to describe the power of their gods or the glory of their ancient kings. And perhaps that is all they are. Perhaps every detail is invented, elaborated, exaggerated. But the details are so specific, so consistent across cultures, that supposedly had no contact with one another. And they describe something that would remain purely fantastical, purely impossible, until the 20th century, when humanity. The tablets do not celebrate these weapons. That is perhaps the most striking thing. If they were purely mythological, invented to glorify the power of gods or kings, we would expect triumph, victory, divine justice, served instead. The texts speak of these weapons with horror, with regret. The gods who use them are described as having crossed a line, as having unleashed something that frightened even them. And after the wars ended, after the cities fell and the skies cleared, the survivors speak of an age of darkness that followed. Years without proper sunlight, crops failing across vast regions, populations collapsing, the world itself becoming hostile to life. This sounds like nuclear winter. The ash and debris thrown into the atmosphere by multiple detonations, blocking sunlight, cooling the planet, disrupting weather patterns for years. It is a phenomenon that was only theorized in the 1980s, and yet it appears described in different words, in texts written thousands of years before Hiroshima taught us what such weapons could truly do. There is a particular silence that follows devastation. Not the silence of peace or rest, but something heavier in absence, so complete, it feels like presence. The kind of silence that settles over ground where nothing will grow, where birds will not land, where even insects seem to sense something wrong in the soil itself. The ancient texts speak of this silence. They describe lands that were abandoned not because invaders claimed them, but because the earth itself rejected life. Places where those who stayed grew sick, where women could not conceive, where children were born twisted and small, if they were born at all. These were the cursed lands. Every ancient culture seems to have had them, territories, marked as untouchable, where even desperate wrecked miles out of their way to avoid crossing. The explanations varied. Angry gods, restless spirits, ancient crimes that had stained the earth permanently. But beneath the mythology, there may have been something simpler, something more practical. The knowledge that certain places were poisoned in ways the ancients could observe, but not understand, could name but not explain. The Sumerians had a word for this, namtar, which translates roughly as fate or destiny, but carried a darker connotation. It referred to a kind of invisible death that struck without warning, that could not be fought or appeased, that simply took those it touched. They were rituals meant to protect against Namtar, but they were strange rituals, not the usual offerings or prayers, but instructions about distance, about not touching certain objects, about washing repeatedly in specific ways, about leaving contaminated items buried in the earth, rather than bringing them into homes. These sound less like religious practices and more like quarantine protocols, like decontamination procedures, like the instructions given to those who work with radioactive materials. Maintain distance, avoid direct contact, bury the waste deep, wash thoroughly, monitor for symptoms. Of course, we cannot know if this connection is real. We cannot know if the Sumerians were responding to actual radiation. But the parallel is there, quiet and troubling. In the clay, what is perhaps most striking is how the tablets describe the withdrawal of the Anunnaki. They do not describe a sudden departure, a vanishing. Instead, they describe a gradual retreat, a pulling. The texts say, grew distant. They stopped walking among humans. They stopped teaching. They built barriers, physical and invisible, between themselves and the people who had once served them. And when asked why, the tablets suggest it was not cruelty but something else. Guilt, perhaps, or fear, or the recognition that they had broken something that could not be repaired. One text describes a council of the Anunnaki, held in the aftermath of the Great War. The gods are arguing. Some want to stay, to rebuild, to continue guiding humanity. But others, the majority it seems, argue that they must leave, that their presence has become too dangerous, that every time they interfere, every time they share knowledge, it leads to greater destruction. They speak of weapons that were created for protection but used for annihilation, of knowledge given in good faith that was turned toward terrible ends. And they conclude with what reads as deep sadness, that humanity must be allowed to forget, that the knowledge of what came before, the age of fire and ruin, must be allowed to fade into myth, into legend, into stories told by old men that no one quite believes anymore. And so they withdrew, not all at once, but slowly over centuries. They closed their temples. They ceased their interventions. They let the knowledge slip away. Let the technology crumble. Let the great works of the earlier age collapse into dust. And they left behind only fragments of tablets pressed with warnings, cities half buried, and the lingering poison in certain soils that even thousands of years could not quite cleanse. This is, of course, one possible interpretation of texts that are fragmentary, damaged, and filtered through multiple translations. But it is a reading that makes a certain kind of sense. It explains why Sumerian civilization appeared so suddenly and so advanced, as if inheriting knowledge rather than developing it gradually. It explains the strange chronological gaps, the sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, existing alongside relatively primitive tools. It explains the tablets that describe inevitable catastrophes that match no natural disaster but sound disturbingly like human-made ones. And it explains the flood. Every ancient culture remembers a flood. The specifics vary, but the core story remains remarkably consistent. There was a world before this one, a world of great cities and proud people, and it was destroyed by water that covered the earth. Only a few survived, warned by benevolent gods or their own wisdom, who preserved enough knowledge to begin again. The story appears in Sumerian texts, in the Hebrew Bible, in Greek mythology, in Hindu texts, in Native American traditions, in cultures separated by oceans and millennia. The flood, it seems, is humanity's deepest shared memory. But what if it was not just one flood? What if what the ancients remembered was not a single catastrophic event, but a process, that long, terrible unwinding, that began with fire and ended with water? The tablets describe this sequence. First came the war, the weapons that turned cities to glass, the poisoned lands, the age of darkness, when the skies were choked with ash and the sun became dim. And then, as the climate destabilized, as the ice melted, or the rains came or the seas rose, however it happened, the floods followed. Not divine punishment, but consequence, cause, and effect. Nuclear winter, giving way to massive climate disruption, sea level changes. the collapse of ancient coastlines where the first great cities might have stood. The survivors of that world, those who made it through both the fire and the flood, were the ones who carried the memory forward. But memories change as they pass through generations. Cause and effect become separated. The weapons become divine wrath. The climate collapse becomes a punishment for human pride. The poisoned lands become cursed by angry gods. The technology becomes magic, and slowly over thousands of years, what was once remembered as history, by the time the Sumerians were pressing their wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, the age of fire was already ancient, already half-forgotten, already transforming into the stories of the Anunnaki, of weapons wielded by gods, of a war in heaven that spilled onto earth. The scribes who recorded these stories may not have fully understood what they were preserving. They wrote what they had been told, what had been passed down, what their grandparents' had whispered in the dark. They wrote it as truth, as sacred history, as the way things were before the world changed. There is a tablet displayed now in a museum, carefully preserved behind glass. It is small, easily held in one hand, covered in neat rows of cuneiform script. The text is a fragment of a longer work, now lost. It describes a city by a river, a beautiful city. The writer says, a place of gardens and wide streets, of markets filled with goods from distant lands, of temples where the gods still sometimes appeared. But then came the war. The writer does not describe the battles themselves. That part of the tablet is missing or was never written. Instead, he describes what came after. He describes walking through the city after it ended. The walls were still standing. The gates were still intact. But inside there was only silence. Bodies lay in the streets, but they had not been struck down in fighting. They lay as if they had simply stopped, mid-motion, mid-breath. The writer touches nothing. He walks quickly, breathing through cloth. And even so, he feels sick by the time he reaches the edge of the city. He travels for days to reach the next settlement, and when he arrives they can tell something is wrong with him. His skin has started to peel. His hair is falling out in clumps. He is dying, though he bears no wounds. The tablet ends with him dictating this account to a scribe, because his hands shake too much to write. He wants it recorded. He wants someone someday to know what happened, that the city fell not to swords or siege, but to something else, something that left the stone standing but erased life, something that poisoned him just by walking through it. The tablet gives no explanation. It simply records, and then it falls silent. Pressed into clay 3,500 years ago by a man whose name we do not know, who died of an illness that sounds precisely like radiation poisoning, describing a weapon that should not have existed for another 3,000 years. We keep these tablets in museum, now we catalog, translate them. We call them mythology. We call them the confused memories of a people who did not yet understand the natural world, who attributed everything they could not explain to the actions of gods. And perhaps we are right. Perhaps every disturbing parallel, every unconscious, is simply coincidence. The human imagination is vast. After all, we can invent anything. We can describe things we have never seen, predict consequences we could never witness, create entire cosmologies from nothing but fear and wonder. Or perhaps the ancients were not imagining. Perhaps they were remembering. There are certain questions we learn not to ask, not because they are forbidden exactly, but because they lead nowhere comfortable. They open doors we would rather keep closed, suggest possibilities that unsettle the neat chronology we have built for ourselves. The story of humanity's steady climb from primitive ignorance toward enlightened knowledge. We prefer that story. It is clean, it is reassuring. It suggests that we are the culmination, the peak, that everything before us was merely prologue. But what if the story is not a climb? What if it is a circle, or worse? What if it is a descent, and we are only now beginning to climb back towards something that was once reached and then lost? The archaeological record has gaps. This is not controversial. Every archaeologist will tell you that what we find is only a fraction of what existed. Wood rots, fabric disintegrates, metal corrodes. Even stone crumbles given enough time. Most of what the ancients built and made and knew has simply vanished. Returned to the earth from which it came, we extrapolate from fragments. And we admit, when pressed, that there could be entire civilizations we have missed, entire ages we know nothing about, buried beneath sediment, or swallowed by the sea or ground to dust, by the slow, patient work of millennia. The Sumerians appeared around 4th 500 BC, already possessing writing mathematics. Before them, we are told, there was nothing comparable. Just scattered tribes, simple villages, the slow development of agriculture. And yet the Sumerians themselves insist otherwise. Their own texts speak of earlier cities, earlier kings, and earlier age, when things were different. They provide lists, king lists, that stretch back impossibly far, naming rulers who reigned for thousands of years, describing cities that existed before the flood. We dismiss these as mythology, as the exaggerations of people who had not yet learned. But what if they were simply using a different calendar? What if the numbers are corrupted, mistranslated, misunderstood, with the essential claim remains true? That there were cities before the cities we can excavate, that there were ages but not the beginning, but the inheritors, the survivors of something that came before and ended badly. The Sphinx in Egypt has weathered patterns on its body that suggest it was eroded by water, not wind. Heavy, sustained rainfall, the kind of rainfall that has not occurred in that region for 10,000 years or more. And yet the Sphinx is traditionally dated to around 2500 BC, when the Sahara was already desert. Geologists look at the erosion patterns and see something that does not match the official timeline. Egyptologists look at the cultural context and see no evidence of a civilization capable of carving such a monument before the Old Kingdom. Both are correct. In their way, both are observing real phenomena. But the phenomena do not agree with each other, so we choose. We privilege one form of evidence over another. We decide that the cultural evidence is more reliable than the geological, or vice versa, and we move on, because dwelling on the inconsistencies helps no one, proves nothing, and only invites speculation that cannot be resolved. But the inconsistencies remain, quiet, patient, waiting. There are structures beneath the ocean, off the coast of India, near Japan, in the Mediterranean, had appeared to be man-made. Walls, foundation. Some are at depths that would require them to have been built when sea levels were much lower, which means they would have to be older than the accepted timeline of civilization allows. Much older, so we say they are natural formations. Unusual, perhaps, suggestive, but natural because the alternative is too complicated. It would require rewriting too much. It would mean admitting that we do not know as much as we claim. The Sumerian tablets speak of a time before the flood, when cities lined the coasts, when great ships traveled between them, when trade and knowledge flowed freely across vast distances, and then the waters rose. Not in a single catastrophic event, though that may have been the final blow, but gradually, over centuries, as the climate changed and the ice melted, and the coastlines that had been home to millions became seabed. The cities that were not abandoned were swallowed, the ports became reefs, the knowledge centers became legends, and those who survived retreated inland, carrying what they could, remembering what they must, and trying to rebuild something like what was lost. This is not impossible. It is in fact exactly what we know happened at the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose dramatically, coastlines changed. If there were cities along those coasts, and there is no reason to assume there were not, they are now underwater, inaccessible, slowly dissolving into the sediment. We would never find them through normal archaeological excavation. We would only find them if we looked deliberately in places where conventional wisdom. But what would those cities tell us, if we found them? Would they show us a gradual development of civilization, the slow climb we expect? Or would they show us something else? Something that suggests knowledge was not slowly accumulated, but quickly lost? That the people who built Sumer and Egypt, and the Indus Valley, were not pioneers, trying to remember and reconstruct what their ancestors had known before the world changed. The tablets describe the Anunnaki as teachers, not creators, not rulers, though they were those things too, but primarily as teachers. They taught humanity to write, to calculate, to observe the stars, to plant crops in season, to build with brick and stone, to smelt metal, to organize cities. This is the role they claim for themselves, again and again. In the text they are the civilizers, the ones who brought knowledge. And for a long time, they were present, active, involved in human affairs. But then something changed. The texts describe a decision made among them, a choice to withdraw. And the reason given is not that humanity had learned enough, but that humanity had learned too much. That certain knowledge of weapons, primarily, but also knowledge of other things the texts only hint at, had been shared or discovered or stolen. And the result was catastrophe, the Great War. The cities turned to glass, the Age of Darkness, and in the aftermath the Anunnaki made a choice. They would leave. They would take certain knowledge with them. They would let humanity start over, simpler, safer, without the tools that had nearly destroyed everything. This is presented in the tablets not as punishment, but as mercy, as the only way to ensure survival. Let the dangerous knowledge fade. Let it become myth. Let enough time pass that even the memory of what was possible become unbelievable. And perhaps in some distant future, if humanity grows wise enough, if they prove themselves capable of handling such power responsibly, they might rediscover it. But not yet. Not while the scars from the last time were still fresh. And so the Anunnaki withdrew. They closed the temples. They stopped appearing. They allowed themselves to become stories, legends, gods who once walked the earth but do so no longer. And humanity, deprived of their teachers, began to forget. The writing became simpler, the mathematics less sophisticated. The astronomy lay free by, not because people were becoming less intelligent, but dissimilage. It takes only a few generations. A disaster that kills the educated class, a war that destroys the libraries, a flood that swallows the cities where the knowledge was kept, and suddenly survivors are starting over, trying to remember what their grandparents be reconstructing from fragments, filling gaps with guesses. This pattern, catastrophic loss, followed by slow rebuilding, is not unique to the ancient world. We have seen it repeatedly throughout history. The Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Rome, the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Every time, knowledge is lost. Every time it takes centuries to recover even a fraction of what was destroyed. And every time the survivors look back at what came before with a mixture of awe and disbelief, wondering how their ancestors achieved things that seem impossible with the tools and knowledge that remain. Now imagine this happening not once, but as the defining event of human prehistory. Imagine a civilization, advanced, sophisticated, perhaps not as technologically developed as ours, but developed enough, that destroyed itself, that went too far, too fast, and paid the price. And imagine the survivors, scattered and traumatized, making a deliberate choice to bury the knowledge that had doomed them. To start over, without the hubris, without the certainty that they could control forces they barely understood. The Sumerian tablets, in this reading, are not mythology, they are history. Distorted history, imperfect history, history passed down through generations of oral tradition, but history nonetheless. An attempt to preserve, in the only language available, what actually happened. The gods were not gods, but people, advanced people, perhaps, or people who seemed godlike to those who came after. But people, the weapons were not divine wrath, but technology. The flood was not punishment, but consequence. And the entire story, the entire arc from glory to destruction, to slow rebuilding, was not invention, but memory. There is something profoundly lonely in the possibility that we are not the first, that others walked this path before us, reached heights we are only now beginning to approach, and fell, not because they were wicked or foolish, but because the trajectory of knowledge has a kind of gravity to it. The more you learn, the more you can do. And the more you can do, the more you can destroy. There is no malice required, only curiosity, only ambition, only the human drive to push further, to test limits, to see what is possible, and sometimes, what is possible should not be done. The tablets speak of regret. This is perhaps their most human quality. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as distant, perfect beings. They make mistakes, they argue, they act out of anger, or fear, or pride, and then they live with the consequences. After the Great War, after the weapons were used and the cities fell, the texts describe councils where the survivors tried to understand what had gone wrong. They had the knowledge, they had the power, they believed they could control it, and they were wrong. There is a particular passage, fragmentary and difficult to translate, where one of the Anunnaki, a figure whose name is lost, speaks about the moment they first created what the text calls the weapon of ending. The description is technical in places, using terms that translators have struggled with because they reference concepts that have no easy equivalent in ancient Sumerian. But the emotional content is clear. The speaker describes pride and ishi, the satisfaction of solving a problem, of creating something new, something powerful, and then almost immediately, the understanding that they had made something that could not be unmade, that the knowledge of how to create it would never truly disappear once it existed, that they had opened a door that could not be closed. The text says they considered destroying their creation, but others argued against it. What if enemies had the same knowledge? What if refusing to develop the weapon left them vulnerable? And so they kept it, they refined it, they made it more efficient, more powerful, and they told themselves it was for defense, for deterrence, that possessing such a weapon would prevent war, not enable it, that no one would be foolish enough to actually use something so devastating. We know how that story ends, because the tablets tell us, and because we have lived it ourselves in miniature. In the 20th century, the same logic, the same assurances, the same terrible discovery that possessing such weapons makes their use not less likely. Because fear drives decisions, because accidents happen, because someone, eventually, decides that survival requires striking first. And then everything that was carefully balanced collapse and fire. The tablets describe the silence that followed, not the immediate aftermath. The tablets have little to say about that, as if the horror was too great to put into words. With the years after, the long, slow realization of what had been done, entire regions were uninhabitable. The climate had shifted, crops failed, populations that had numbered in the millions were reduced to scattered survivors, and among those survivors the knowledge keepers, the priests and scribes and teachers, made a choice. They would not pass down the knowledge of how to create such weapons. They would let it die with them. This was not an easy choice. The tablets are clear about that. There were arguments. Some believed that forgetting was dangerous, that future generations might make the same mistakes if they did not understand what had happened. But others prevailed with a simple observation. The problem was not that previous generations did not understand the danger. The problem was that understanding the danger was not enough. Humans, given the knowledge and the means, would eventually use such weapons. Perhaps not for generations, but eventually, fear or ambition or desperation would provide the justification. And so the only safety was in genuine ignorance, in making sure that future humans could not recreate what had destroyed the world, because they simply did not know it was possible. And so they began the process of forgetting, deliberately, systematically. They closed the schools where such knowledge was taught. They destroyed the records that contained the most dangerous information. They encode what remained in myth and symbol, in stories that preserved a warning but not a blueprint. And they withdrew, letting humanity start over without them, hoping that the new beginning would take a different path. This is, of course, speculation, a reading of ancient texts that may be entirely wrong. Perhaps the Anunnaki were never real. Perhaps they were invented by the Sumerians to explain their own existence, to give weight and authority to their laws and customs. Perhaps every similarity to modern nuclear weapons is coincidence, the inevitable result of humans trying to describe ultimate power in any age. Perhaps the vitrified stone and the strange silence of certain ancient sites have mundane explanations we simply have not yet discovered. But there is a weight to these texts, a consistency, a sense that they are trying to communicate something important, even if we cannot fully understand what. They feel like testimony, like someone trying to make sure that what happened would not be entirely forgotten, even if the details became confused, even if the truth transformed into legend. They feel like a warning, and we did not heed it, could not heed it, because we did not recognize it for what it was. We read the tablets as mythology, dismissed the descriptions as impossible, and proceeded to discover for ourselves, independently, inevitably, the same terrible knowledge. We created the same weapons. We walked the same path. And now we live in a world where the fire that consumed the ancient cities is a button press away, where the silence that followed their devastation could be our own at any moment. The question that haunts anyone who sits with these tablets long enough is not whether the ancients possessed nuclear weapons. The evidence is too fragmentary for certainty. The question is whether it matters, whether the specific technology is less important, whether what the tablets are really telling us is not about uranium and fission, but about the human condition, about what happens when a species gains the power to destroy itself before it develops the wisdom to choose not to. Every survives long enough, the threshold where knowledge outpaces wisdom, where capability exceeds restraint. And at that threshold there are only two paths forward. Either the civilization develops the institutional and moral frameworks necessary to constrain its own power to choose deliberately not to do everything it can do, to accept limits even when no external force requires them, or it does not. And if it does not, the weapons are eventually used, maybe not immediately, maybe not deliberately, but eventually, because fear accumulates, because trust erodes, because someone, somewhere, decigen, the surist, that used the weapons, that paid the price, and that left behind in clay and stone and fading memory the story of what happened, not as entertainment, not as religious instruction, but as a warning to whoever came after to us, saying, "We were here, we were as real as you are, we thought we were wise, we thought we were safe, we thought we could control what we had created, and we were wrong. Learn from us. Do not make our mistakes. Do not believe that possessing such power makes you invulnerable. It makes you fragile. One mistake away from silence. But we did not learn. We could not because we did not believe the warning was meant literally. We read it as myth, as allegory, as the confused memories of people who had never seen real power, and so invented it in their stories. And perhaps we were right. Perhaps there is no connection at all between the ancient tablets and our modern weapons. Perhaps the Anunnaki never existed. Perhaps the war in heaven was only ever metaphor. Or perhaps we are living proof that the cycle repeats. That knowledge has a shape, a trajectory, that leads inevitably to certain discoveries, and that once those discoveries are made, once the weapons are built, not because humans are inherently destructive, but because we are inherently afraid, will eventually pull the trigger. The tablets end, most of them, a kind of quiet resignation. The Anunnaki withdraw. The cities fall. The survivors scatter. And the world begins again, smaller, simpler, safer, for a while. No sense of justice served, only exhaustion. The exhaustion of those who have seen too much, lost too much, and no longer have the strength to fight. They record what happened. They warn whoever might read it someday. And then they fall silent, leaving only the clay to speak for them. And now we hold those tablets. We catalog them. We place them in museums behind glass. Artifacts of a dead civilization. Interesting primarily for what they tell us about the development of writing, about ancient religion, about the earliest forms of urban organization. We treat them as historical curiosities, as windows, as evidence of how far we have come. But perhaps we should read them differently. Perhaps we should read them as mirrors, as reflections of a choice we are still making, as testimony from those who stood where we stand now and chose poorly. Perhaps the tablets are not about the past at all. Perhaps they are about the future, our future. And perhaps the Anunnaki's final gift was not the knowledge they shared, but the knowledge they chose to take with them when they left. The understanding that some doors once opened can never truly be closed. There are nights when the stars feel closer than they should, when the distance between now and then seems thinner, more permeable, when you can almost hear the voices of those who came before, speaking across the millennia in a language we have forgotten how to understand. They carved their warnings into clay, they pressed their memories into the earth, They left behind fragments of a story that does not fit comfortably into the narrative we have built for ourselves. We stand now where they may have stood, possessing knowledge that grants us power beyond measure, power to build or destroy, power to shape the world or end it. And like them, they were real. If any of this is more than myth, tell ourselves we are wise enough to handle it, that we understand the risk, that we will never let fear or pride or desperation drive us to use what we have created. That this time will be different. Perhaps it will be. Perhaps we have learned something they did not know. Perhaps our institutions are stronger, our wisdom deeper, our restraint more reliable. Perhaps the tablets are only stories. After all, invented by people who never faced the choices we face, who never stood at the edge of their own potential extinction, and had to decide whether to step back or forward. Or perhaps the tablets are exactly what they appear to be, memory, a warning spoken in the only language available, preserved in the only medium that could survive the ages. Perhaps the Anunnaki were real. Perhaps they walked this earth, built cities, taught and learned, and loved and feared, just as we do. Perhaps they created weapons they could not uncreate. And perhaps in the end, they withdrew not because they were gods returning to heaven, but because they were survivors, leaving a poisoned world, hoping that those who came after might find a better way. We will never know with certainty. The past keeps its secrets. The clay can only tell us so much. Perhaps certainty would be dangerous. It would allow us to dismiss the warning entirely if we decided it was false, or to despair if we decided it was true. Uncertainty leaves room for choice, for agency, for the possibility that even if others have walked this path before and failed, we might yet succeed. The tablets remain, waiting in museums and archives, and the unexcavated ruins of cities we have not yet found. They ask nothing, they demand nothing, they simply testify. They say, fire fell from the sky once, cities became glass, the earth was poisoned, lasted for ages. They do not tell us what to do with that knowledge. They cannot. They can only bear witness the choice, or choice, remains unmade, the future remains unwritten, and somewhere in the dark, in the clay, in the fading memory of what came before, the ancients wait to see if we will choose differently than they did, or if the cycle will begin again.